21. The Solar Tide. Durank watched them come with a steel conviction the likes of which he'd never known before. He had, of course, spoken words of reassurance and grit to the Tujuhdanau Lautani, now sharing his position astride the dense bank of shattered brickwork which formed their barricade, and to the militiamen he commanded. Indeed, he'd believed every word. But to hold something true in faith and theory was a far different thing than to hold true to that faith and theory when it came under harsh test. Had he not learned his vulnerability to such things when he had failed just such a test of his will and devotion on the ruins of the first wall all those hard weeks ago? The crucible of cleansing had, of course, purified the stain of such failure, as much as it could be purified. Yet still the memory of that failure, along with his own mortal doubts about the reasons for his survival where so many others had perished, had ruled his sunrises and sunsets, with even the stark light of warm noon or the sights of his home shadowed by them. But his old spiritual mentor, the Gilder Durtu, whose grip had been worn not by years of rifle bolts and entrenchment shovels, but by the meticulous turning of drills and engravers' tools, was steady of hand on his left, muttering a prayer for a grandson he had not seen all the last week. So it was with all Durank's men, so many of them neighbors, their eyes alive with the warm, simmering righteousness in the dusk. Perhaps, Durank entertained, it was because their king, battle-worn just as they were, stood with them, and the royal guard were among them. Even if the Shaishan destroyer plate put the metal hides of Gunug's royal soldiery, which had become largely ceremonial over the past 5 centuries, to shame in terms of function, the Golden Guardians still were a great comfort to look upon. In them lived memories of ages when the dawn came brighter, and there was yet more time in the daylight left to their storied kindred, roughened by the tumult of siege, but still prepared to give what remained in service. And yet the Lautani, who knew far less of any history which might embolden them to defend Surgirkar, or bleed beneath the eyes of its Gazorgu-blooded kingly line, were just as firm as the lion folk in whose midst they fought. As so often before, this was what steeled Durank, and made mechanical his own bravery. With such valor about him, even from those with far less at stake, how dare he show the slightest sign of tremor or doubt? And so he did not. As the streets filled with the enemy's soldiery, singing and chanting as they poured from alley or clan compound into the lanes to be torn by the guns on the barricades, Durank's hand and eye felled them just as efficiently as the others, the ache which had lingered in his arm since that bullet beyond the second wall fading away to nothing. But he and the thousands in the southern plaza, firing from the makeshift fortifications into the lower city, were not alone. The Temple of the Sun was alive with all who had withdrawn there, and upon all the tiers of the great ziggurat, mortar and machine gun and massed rifles were being fired for the hordes of the enemy. Countless more struggled on the north face of the monument, fronting the now drained Port Solar, where the legions of Sholo-Shaidi were climbing canal walls and storming bridges. The last of Lautan's dwindling planes, launched now from the most treacherous of improvised runways on the upper tiers, circled low and risked the raking of their own craft by fire from the ground to strafe the foe, and were in their turn shot down by the golden craft of Sholo-Shaidi in the growing dark. Flare and fire went up to light the young knight. The whole of the mountainous monument thrummed with life as if it were a Titan hive, and the death which emanated from it shamed that wrought by any carnivorous swarm from distant Baru Lautan. And yet, the Shaishans, as had been the case throughout the day preceding, were more than prepared to die. And they did so with songs still on their lips and weapons clasped tight in their hands. Their fellows were taking up positions on rooftops to hurl mortars back at the tiered ziggurat, or rain death from above upon the barricades on the plaza. And it was in the south they pushed most violently. For while they pinned the northern defenders to the temple with their push from the upper city, on the eaves of the lower, they had buildings to aid them in this murder from above. Ug and Lautani were cut down by enemies they had never sighted, as they themselves shot down Shaishans sprinting the streets with bayonets fixed. The corpses piled in drifts like wind-blown snow, and the brick beneath boots was wetted again after these short hours void of rain, with the fresh slick of blood. Through din and doom, minutes passed, ears rang, and the enemy worked closer and closer, firing back from doorway or gatehouse or alcove. And suddenly they were close enough for grenades to reach the defenders, and as the first clanged down and thumped their gusts of fragmented death into the foe, King Shamat of Gunug was roaring orders to withdraw, calling, "With me." None of Durank's militiamen needed to be told twice. So, rather than worrying about his soldiers, Durank shouted these orders in turn to the Lautani beside him, a move mimicked across the barricades as Ug dragged catfolk along with them towards the stair. And at their backs, a skeleton guard of the royal soldiery remained, selling dearly their lives as Ektal took the tangle with bayonet and pistol and jagged blade. Pahala, the taller one, had to rip the stockier Berani from his post and drag him to get him started for that distant route upward. As Durank tore his attention from the others and put his full focus on the retreat up the ziggurat, he had cause to look after his king and follow the path before them to the heights of the temple. And his breath was stolen by the sky he saw above them. The new light upon the city below had, perhaps, been obstructed to him by the stark shadows cast by flares and the dancing shudder of their passage into distant quarters of the urban sprawl. But as he looked up the sweep of the stair towards the heights of the ziggurat, he saw that the pillar of dawn emanating from the ruined wreckage of the unseen palace far above was shining near white and blinding up from the well. It pierced the night cloud above, and its gleam was so strong that it backlit the whirling veil there from above, as if a single, constant blink of lightning had been frozen in place beyond. It was brighter than Durank had ever seen it before, and Sir Girkar's countless murals and gilded reliefs winked in the light of it from afar through the night. Durank ran the vast yards of the plaza span, eyes locked on the heights of the steps, where positions were already being taken at the zenith. He wheeled to aid Durtu, who had slipped upon the flight, but the man was shot in the back mid-fall even as Durank reached him. The gilder's air was driven from him in one wheezing rattle, and he slid down in a thumping tumble back beneath the coming crowd. And Durank moved on, leaving yet another piece of his past behind him to die upon the stone. Several Shaishan machine guns behind had opened up upon the fleeing from compound roofs overlooking the plaza, and the lionfolk and catfolk fell beneath them like barley at harvest. Then the stairs were beneath him. The pair of young Lautani were beside him, and many of his militia before. The king, somewhere above and ahead, was continuing his thunderous cries of encouragement, and Durank's legs pumped harder at the sound. Whether royal guard or regular soldier or panting militiaman or beleaguered marine, the banners of the king were being raised upon the height before them to beckon them onward, and the desperation to escape the open sweep of the stair seemed physically to drive them up from below. Behind, the Sholoshaishans were through the barricades and crossing the plaza, the hounds of war at the heels of their cornered prey. A tangle of men, both surged forward from the inner temple and newly arrived atop the stair, were rallying breathless at the peak, eager to fire down on the Shaishans as they pursued. King Shamat was among them, screaming for time, for delay of the foe, for every effort to be spent in their halt upon the stair. But this long, sweeping ascent was in places switchback, just as was the more decorated stairway on the northern face. This, combined with the stragglers still running with the enemy on their heels, either too wounded or too breathless to have finished the flight, slowed their firing. They had to pick their targets and judge well, even from above. And as Durank turned to join them, he was for the second time rendered cold as his heart leapt in his chest and his mouth drew in a ragged gasp of the heavy gun-smoke-tinged air. For the dark, metal-clad Ektal made up the van of the foe. Having crashed through one of the east barriers to the plaza, their doubtless tired legs had been strengthened by the scent of royal prey, and they had overtaken their fellows, who fell back behind them to allow the shock troops to take the brunt of Ugg punishment. The Ektal destroyers were not impenetrable, but they were fiercely resilient, for to them agonized ache of fractured rib or welting flesh beneath plate and pad was a thing of mundane inconvenience. And they climbed with few losses, drawing the worst of the small arms fire and allowing their uniformed men climbing behind a measure of reprieve from the steel slaughter. Cries of war were in their mouths, and the keen weapons of their craft were brandished in their hands, already darkened with the lifeblood of lionfolk slaughtered over the day's combat. Thousands of them, and all hungered for more. It was Durank's first time seeing the Shaishan elite's upper echelons fully arrayed for war in person, and it struck a deep chord of ancestral fear in the Ugg's racing heart. But still his hands worked the familiar rifle, as did all those about him, guardsmen of the temple pushing forth to be first to meet the enemy. Durank heard Berani call out to his friend that their rounds would do more good in the unarmed legionnaires behind, or else down on the plaza. Sage words, but Durank, seeing that these reborn paladins of Harakwe would reach them soon regardless, shouted for his men to aim for the joints and eyes of the foe, and to strike at neck or knee with bayonet when opportunity allowed. The crash of arms and men before him, the firing of rifles followed by the thump of metal on flesh or steel rising above the clatter of boot and equipment at flight. Sawed shotguns favored by the Ektal were loosed devastating into the defenders from feet away, and then the full brunt of impact was felt. Even upward, with the charge robbed of much of its force by the grueling ascent and the angle of engagement, the Ektal broke as a heavy wave, and swept many before them as they took the ridge of the first rise. And Durank, a couple ranks back, saw the men before him cut down or carved to bits by blade, or shattered beneath club and hammer. He thought of the fight upon the hill in the hinterland weeks past, where even Ektal garbed only in fabric and wielding, for the most part, only rifle and knife, had butchered so very many of his men for each of them which fell. The same brutal efficiency and drilled, coordinated balance of motion was on full display here, hindered not at all by the artful flow of armor over sinew. They moved like dancers through the throng, purposeful and keen, dealers of death by shell to chest or saw-toothed blade to neck and limb. Had he not been arrayed opposing them, it would have been a sort of macabre poetry in motion to Durank. In his haze he was knocked back by the falling of the lifeless, beheaded corpse of the militiaman before him, and though Durank kept his feet, he found himself being pulled back from the thickest fighting by the natural repulse of men, away from the carving arms of the Ektal. It was divinity's touch which showed Durank what he saw next, and he believed as much even then. There was a shimmer of movement above the heads of the warring masses, and another behind. The glimmering helm of tall and proud Shamat XII, touched seemingly by a stray ray from the unseen pillar of dawn skyward to draw the eye, pursued close by a towering figure clad in dark plate, and backed by a mangled crest of black and gold plume. Some nobleman or captain of the Shaishan kindred, he knew at once, perhaps even their king, or one of their kings. Fighters of the royal guard were throwing themselves into the pursuer's path only to be cut down, as others called the King of Gunug onward in desperation. And understanding took hold in him. The Sun King was making for his temple. Whatever time had been bought, it had to be enough. There was now no more delay, and Durank, feeling drawn as if a strong, warm wind were at his back, shifted off into the crowd after them, shoulder first, calling out to those about him, reaching out to direct the attention of the other defenders. His arm closed around a thick shoulder, and he glanced back to see Berani, lancing at Ektal duelists with his bayonet over the shoulders of those before him. The king! But Durank did not need to speak, and he saw Berani's strange, narrow-pupiled eyes widen and focus. And then they were both moving, the smaller following the larger. Several others in the ranks shifted with them, but the desperate press of so many to defend the upper tier at the mouth of the stairs swept away many more. So consumed with the desire to throw back the Shaishans were the men that the sight of their king under threat alarmed only those nearest, and by the time they realized, they had often been cut down by the invading commander pacing the monarch as his hunter, or the blades of the other Ektal who trailed him. Lieutenant Durank was not himself in that moment, or perhaps it would be better to say he was truly himself for the first time, free of worry for future or past. He was fully present, aflame with the anger of his people. And he emerged from the mob roaring like a beast, the angular bayonet of his rifle leading, weaving its way towards the legs of the foe. And he struck home. The blade slid several inches through the mesh of spider silk and padding behind the joint, and planted itself down through the meat within. But the joint was not severed, and he tumbled with the force of his impact. The rifle was ripped from his hands, and before even Durank had righted himself, fumbling with the sheath of a knife at his belt, the Sholo Shaishan hunter had slid free the weight of the rifle to clatter on the stone. He limped now, pronouncedly, his weight awkwardly bent to one side. But the hunter was a giant among his people, a feature accentuated by the plate and towering feathers of rank on his shoulders, and even maimed and lopsided he loomed over Durank as a passive executioner. His gaze was not even on the gasping lieutenant, but rather on his prey moving further through the mass. The edged teeth of his blade flashed in the light from above, and Durank fell to the stone beneath them, his right hand, the one which had been slipping free the knife, severed beneath the wrist. It was only as Durank rolled upon the bloody ground, warm and wet, the cruel white of bone jutting from the stump of his hand seeming emblazoned on his eyes like a flashbang even when they left the wound, that he realized the same blow had rent him open. His abdomen was gaping like an open mouth along his flank, and his dark uniform was made black by the rich blood which was seeping onto it. His left hand, his only hand, he thought with frightening clarity, closed over the cut, and he felt the hot slick of viscera pooled at his side as a length of his exposed innards slipped like serpents from their place in his stomach to pool upon the brick. He did not, in the moment, even feel the pain, just the fear and the anger. And then Boots beside him, moving for that hunter beyond, still staggering after his prey, as if the deep stab down into the back of his calf meant little more than a stone in the boot of a mortal man. It was Berani, that hunter's pursuer, the fallen, blocky blade of a defeated royal guardsman in his hand, a curved Carice knife in the other. He must have taken it up from the ground on the run, Durank thought. Immediately, Durank began awkwardly pulling himself along the ground after the Lautani corporal on his elbows, a trail of gore in his wake and his insides unspooling in the blood and refuse of death as he moved. Boot thumped or trod upon him in the chaos around, but never did he slow. Their weapons clashed as the Shaishan hunter turned to face the newcomer. He caught the youth's downward swing of the heavy sword with his maquahuit and turned the weapon aside. The knife came up toward the invader's helmed head, but was slapped away by the vambrace of the hunter's offhand. The hunter's grip twitched, the flick and angling of a wrist, seemingly delicate, but Berani's severed sword arm fell to the ground beside him, and the corporal caught the armored left fist of the hunter in the jaw afterward. But Berani, it seemed to the crawling Durank, was not done. This was no novice to brawl or the tangle of grapple and contest, even if he were no match for a legate of the Ektal blade to blade. And the sturdy oarsman of the lake, Dadu, Durank believed he had called it, fell with shoulder lowered. As he hit the ground, Berani wrapped the maimed leg of the hunter in his uninjured arm and swept that armored figure from his feet. The Ektal legate landed hard atop Berani, knocking the wind from him, but also lending Durank the leverage he needed. Then Durank, still crawling, was on them, driving the knife gripped vice-tight in his remaining hand into the throat of the hunter beneath his collar, again and again. It was not a duelist's end, a writhing, bleeding, dirty thrashing on the brickwork like lower animals locked throat to jaw. And yet Durank found no shame in that, the filth and the fury. For his tired eyes, already heavy with loss of his life's blood, raked the crowd before him, and he saw not a hint of the king beyond. Shamat XII had made the temple, unchecked by the hunter's blade. Berani was writhing to extricate himself from beneath the hulking corpse of the Sholoshaishan swordsman, who still twitched and clung to his fading life. But the foe was too weak or too preoccupied with the blood filling his collar and throat to obstruct the young man from Dadu, and Berani was soon at Durank's side, eyes wide at the sight of him. Though Durank still felt little, he knew it must look bad. The intestines trailing him like worms on wet street had certainly been trampled and torn by the countless feet falling about them. He opened his mouth to draw breath, and for the first time registered that this was halting, stuttering, and difficult. "Go," he said. "The temple. Go." His words were rasped, soft, almost lost to the din. But Berani seemed to understand, for there was a subtle shake of the head, and he made to drag Durank on. Berani pulled down the veil the catfolk kept up in battle, as if to speak. The motion was clumsy. The younger man reached with the stump of his elbow first before correcting, realizing anew that the arm beneath was gone. But then Pahala, the other of their lakes, was beside him, himself gashed and turbanless, but still standing. "Berani," Durank heard him say. "Come on. We have to go." "Go," Durank said again. He knew it was the last word he could give. Pahala pulled Berani away into the tangle, towards the open doors to the south end of the great temple chamber within. Though Berani resisted at first, the corporal was losing a great deal of blood himself, and before the pair were out of Durank's sight, the lieutenant saw the grunting Pahala lift his companion up onto his back like a sack of grain, and carry him on into the interior. And there Durank lay, chest down and head craned upward, the corpse of whatever Shaishan commander they had felled shoulder to shoulder with him. As the pool about the two figures deepened, and more bodies were added to the expanse, and kick or stumble struck Durank as he lay prone, the lieutenant still watched on. More and more of the defenders were falling, or being pushed into the interior. Beyond, the light of the base of the Pillar of Dawn was visible in the hall, the very chamber in which he had sung or worshipped under Durtu, or watched the eclipse ceremonies on the knees of grandparents, or heard the vows of his sister to her husband, wherever they were now. He hoped they were within, safe. That glow flickered and then died. There was a quaking shiver in the stone about him, and Durank saw the gateway inward collapse as brick and mortar sheeted down in a slide from the higher tiers to bury it. Durank rolled onto his back, blurred vision skyward, and saw that there too the pillar was gone. Not weak, but absent, vanished from the night sky. And all, despite the rounds or explosives or the distant hiss of flares, seemed dark. But somehow for Durank this was not a thing of dread, as it would have been in any other circumstance. He was overcome in those final seconds of his life, as the last of the defenders left outdoors were put to the muzzle or blade by a sensation of warm and welcome ease. "All is right," a voice seemed to whisper to him through the clamor. "You are almost there." It was his mother's voice. He recognized it at once. How could he not? The sky was a vague color to Durank by then. It seemed to brighten overhead, a flare like a vast lamp off beyond the clouds, like the drowned sun on a wet season's day. It grew brighter and brighter, and he found he could not look away from the depths of it. And before any of the enemy could find him gasping there in the tangle and end him, Durank of Sir Girkar was gone, the city of his birth still cloaked in night about him.